Well, hello and welcome to this video. We are going to be learning about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm editor over at FileMakerMagazine.com. And in today's video, we're taking a look at starting a project, basically just putting everything in place as we start a new project. Hang in there. We'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, so what do we have for today? Today we're going to be starting our project, but just before we do that, there's one thing that I had that came up in the previous video. If you've been watching this in series, then you know that I hit a little issue and I didn't want to try to solve the problem live, and that was because who wants to see somebody fumble around for 5 to 10 minutes figuring out what the actual problem was? The cool thing was, the thing that happened is something that gives us a sequence of steps to always check for when we come across this type of issue in FileMaker. So I'm actually glad that the mistake actually happened. So the file that's linked, as I show the file here, no file for you to create. It's linked on the previous video in this series. And by the way, if you're interested in following these in series, you happen to find this video on YouTube, just click on the channel icon and then that will take you to my channel, and then scroll down a little bit and you will see each of these series as playlists where you can get them all in order, just in case you found this video out of order. So the issue that we were having was, as I zoom in here, we wanted to be able to have a value list show up, and I went through the process of saying how to solve the problem. In fact, as I go into define database, this was the field that we were using as a key field, this unstored attendance. And what happened is I explained yesterday that if you have nothing in a relationship, FileMaker can't resolve nothing to the other side of a relationship. So you have to have something, even if that relationship is a non-equijoin. So I was suggesting that you actually use the value of false, and indeed it does work, but the key issue came down to the value list itself. So our learning lesson here is, here are the sequence of steps that you always want to go through whenever a relationship is not actually working or the technique is not working for how you expect it to work. Because I was expecting it to, but it just didn't. So the first thing to check is this right here. Make sure, I don't know if my head's blocking that, but make 100% sure that the relationships on both sides are actually the same type. So FileMaker expects number to number, text to text, date to date, time to time, etc. It's a one-to-one relationship, except for the one situation where a multi-key field, which is almost always going to be a text field, it holds multiple keys in a return delimited format, can relate to any other type of single field, such as a number, a date, or a time. And those are pretty much the two types of relationships you have, like for like, or a multi-key, which is text relating to one of the other types. And so that's the number one thing. Now, I had checked that yesterday, but the one thing that I didn't check was the actual value list itself. So if you go to the previous day's lesson, I think it was lesson 8, then you download that file, you will find the solution was actually the value list itself. The reason that the values were not showing, because you can see that they are now, this person, Matt again, has no current records that he is attending any events. As I switch to another record, you can see that this person, Bob Smith, clearly has 3 events, 1, 2, and 3. And I have 3 keys for Bob, 1, 2, and 3. So when we get to that new person that doesn't have any, we of course want to show all of the options. We can do that with false. Our relationship is now working, and the key was this. The problem I had when we go to manage and value lists was in the value list itself. So what happened is I was actually in the process 2 lessons ago teaching you how to structure up this this value list. What I had done is I was actually including only related values, and I was starting from the context of attendees. That's what you will find if you go download that file, or if you're interested in completing this fix yourself. I don't want to just give you the answers. I want you to learn to know how to solve the problems yourself. My context was incorrect. And so I needed to switch the context from attendees, the join table, to people. And once I did that, everything worked as I expected, as I was showing it in my head. So I wasn't going crazy. That's a good thing to know. The sequence of steps is always check all of the pieces in the puzzle to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do. And those are, check that your data types work between your relationships. You're actually going the proper key type to the proper key type. And then if you're using a value list, make sure that you're coming from the right table occurrence, which in this case, I was coming from this one, but I actually wanted to come from this one to this one for these two to use my value list, not that one. So that's our solution. All right. So that only took us a few minutes to explain. We can now get into today's topic. We are going to be starting our project. For probably the remainder of this series, we're going to be going through using this project for the purpose of actually learning scripting, learning layout and user interface design, learning everything else that I can show you about FileMaker. So as I hide this file, I am not going to give you this file right off of the bat. And yesterday, we talked about a little bit about data planning. You know, to be honest, I didn't like the flow of yesterday's video. It probably came off okay, but I felt like I wasn't giving you enough details. I'm very much a hands-on person. I like to see things, and I bet you do too, so I am going to show you them. So here is FileMaker's time billing application, and it's set up in a format that was very specific to somebody's needs. And I likewise have set up my ugly, don't judge this on its looks right off the bat, my ugly representation of how I actually manage my work. What we're going to do is we're going to follow along. So I'm going to keep this one in the background because it's always nice to have a reference database or reference software or reference solutions. In fact, this is a good part of your data planning stage. If you go out and look at what other things exist, you will pick up ideas for what you might want to add or maybe things that you're missing while you're developing your own database. So this may have features that I want to put into my solution or our solution as we build it. So I'll just hide that for right now. I suggest that you do this. Go to File, go to New Solution, and then follow along because you're not going to have access to this file right off the bat. We're going to see what we've done. So I'm going to create a new solution, go to my desktop, and I'll just call it Time Track, I think, because I already have Time Tracker. Oh, it's got a space, so I'll just call it Time Track. Not to be too confusing, right? All right, so what are the first things that I do on a file, on a brand new file? The very first thing is I create a startup table. If we go take a look at this particular file and I go into Define Database or Manage Database, we zoom in, you can see that there is a startup table. Now I have a video on YouTube about this process, but this is just one of the things that I do. So it's a little bit of rehash. You can go look at the startup splash screen video here on YouTube. But it's what I do. Step number one, I rename the base table, which the base table that's created, the initial table, adopts the name of the file. That's typically not something you usually want. I just rename mine to startup, and that's it. Now that's just going to be, I'll click change, that's just going to be a 0 fields, 0 records database. Reason being, when we come into the database, we know that when a FileMaker file opens, multiple people tend to be using this file, unless you're just creating it for yourself. Those multiple people typically have different objectives. Managers have a different perspective than a data entry person. A data entry person has a different perspective than the shipping department, and so on. So the first thing we want to do is dump people into an empty table. So the next thing that I do is I go into layout mode. I want to make sure that my layout is actually associated to that particular table, and it actually is, which is good because I just renamed it. We can always see in the Manage Layouts what layout is tied to what table by looking at our column right here. I can see that startup is tied to my startup table occurrence, and we're all good there. All right, the very next thing that we do is we want to make sure that FileMaker is going to start on this empty table. That's all handled within a file's options. Now, each file has its own options, and we can see that under the File menu, where we choose our file options. Now, when the file options come up, we can actually set those. The first step that I make is this one right here, switch to a layout. Now, I explained this before in a previous video when we were talking about FileMaker's environment. The way that FileMaker's startup process works is the following. If this is not checked, then whatever the last layout the file was on when it was closed, that's the layout that will be the default. If you check this box in the file options, that is the first layout that FileMaker is going to go to. Then the third step is what script is going to run on file startup, which we're going to set here in just a few. And that's where you get your ultimate control. So by default, I am defaulting to a table and a table occurrence and a layout, all tied to basically have nothing. Meaning FileMaker is not going to be loading any data. I'm not going to a particular table occurrence that's tied to a table that has any records that will show. That will make things very fast. Next thing I do is I will set my minimum version. For me these days, I typically choose 14 because 14 was the version that included button bars. I consider them immensely invaluable. If you have 12 or 13, obviously you're going to stay lower than that. One thing that you don't want to set this too low to is it needs to correspond to your FileMaker server. So for example, you can have a copy, put in FileMaker 16 features into a copy of FileMaker, but that file can still be hosted on a FileMaker 15 server. So that means you would need to set this minimum to whatever version of server you are using, not necessarily the copy of FileMaker. So I'm going to set mine to 14. We're going to be actually setting up a username or a password on this by default. And typically what I do is before this file is ever hosted, I do uncheck that right there because I always want the file to prompt when it's going to be hosted for what the user is going to be. All right, the very next step is script triggers. Let's create our on first window and our on last window close. I call them startup and shutdown. Some people name their scripts on first window, some name them on last window close. We don't have to go into the script space in order to create these. We can do them right here. I can click and just say specify the script, click the plus sign because I'm right here, and just call this whatever I want. I tend to call mine startup. Start up and say OK. No big deal. I really don't need anything in this script right now. All I need to do is assign it so that I know that there is a reserved script that will run when I'm actually going to be using this file. Say OK, and there we go. You know, one thing, if you are going to be taking this isn't a specific question, I think, on the FileMaker certification test, but most all scripts in all of FileMaker tend to have this extra box down at the bottom where it allows you to have script parameters. One thing you might want to notice is that the on first window open and the on last window open and the two window scripts are scripts that do not actually allow a parameter. Any of the file option scripts do not allow you to do that. So just a little key thing. All rest of the script triggers, they all allow you to pass parameters. All right, so let's put on our shutdown. Not as critical as the startup. Startup, you always want to bootstrap, is what they call it, have the database do certain things as it loads up. But shutdown, you don't always use this, but I just wire it up just in case because I think the file should have that, just in case I need to use it. Doesn't hurt me to have it here, so I like to put it in. All right, so I've got my startup script, I've got my shutdown script. I also have on open settings, I've got my file set. I've turned off my login, which now reminds me that I need to go set up my password. I can choose whether or not keychain access is going to be something that I'm going to use. By default, looks like it's unchecked. If you do want to allow people to actually store their passwords, you'll need to check that on. And if you want it to work with the iOS ability to have, I think this is the thumbprint. I haven't used this in a while, then you might want to check that one right there. All right. Also, if you are taking full control over FileMaker, definitely you'll probably want to hide all toolbars as startup. You can also put that in your startup script, but we'll save that for a startup script video. All right, so let's go finish out the rest of what I do. Go to Manage and Security, which we've taken a look at. We can see that FileMaker gives us this alert right off the bat. I'm going to currently ignore this because as FileMaker is set up by default, when I open it with preferences that show me the simple stuff, I don't want the simple stuff, I want the detailed stuff. So I choose this option right here. And now I simply, as a first step, rename this to whatever I'm going to access the file as an account. And I will typically give it a password. Now I'm going to show you something that's actually pretty helpful. Yeah. Okay, I'll save that for another day. I was going to show you a little trick that I do sometimes with regards to when a file opens, the startup script can determine. Oh, okay, let's just show it anyway. I would typically change this to whatever account I am going to use, Matt or admin. I'm going to leave admin on. you would put your own name, admin on this, and I'll probably leave it as no password because I am going to be distributing this database. But this would be a step where it would start to actually assign my developer accounts, and then later on I'll create my security as I evolve the solution. All right, and I'm going to say allow on this, and of course we always need to confirm, and I've got no password, so I'll say okay. I do need to make a trip back to that file options because when this does open, I do want it to actually I'll just leave that off. It'll be fine to prompt for the password each time. If I get annoyed by it, I can either save the password or put it on the file default. It's always just a good practice not to have a file ever open with a admin full access account and a blank password. In fact, this got FileMaker in trouble to the degree that they have now set FileMaker server so that when you upload a file that has a blank password, server won't open it unless you override that within FileMaker server settings. But any version prior to 16, I think, FileMaker is just happy for you to upload a database with admin and a blank password. So it's a good thing to actually just turn that off and not have it on. All right, so now we need our initial layout, or now is when we start to develop our database. Now, yesterday we talked about our data planning and what we are going to do. Because we are creating a very simple time tracking database, I can actually reference this if I want to. There's my 3 tables. I've got times and projects. That's it, really simple right now. Now, as I discussed in yesterday's video, I decided to take the approach where each individual record only stores one time. And that time could be the start or the stop of any type of session. It could be the start of a work session, and then another record would be the stop of that work session. It could be the start of a break that I take, which will inherently fall within a session. So think about this. You start a session at 8 in the morning and you end a session at 5 in the day or 5 in the afternoon. That would be a full session. Well, with other individual time slots, you can actually start to track things in between where you get more information. That's one of the things I was trying to explain yesterday in the data planning, is by virtue of the fact that because time is continuously moving forward, if I track things in individual records, I can pull things as I want them rather than having all of the data tied into a particular record, because then it becomes a lot more difficult to extract the data out of the individual record if I have, say, 4 different time fields. Number one, I'm limiting myself, because if I make a record for tracking time and I allow for a start time, an end time, and then only one break with a start and an end of that break, well, now I would have to build a horizontal table, meaning if I want to add in the ability for another break, I have to add yet another field. I don't want to do that. So like I talked about in yesterday's lesson, I want the most atomic unit to be tracked in just one record, and that's just one timestamp. So let's go add the projects table, or the time table, because that's the core of what we're dealing with. So over here in our database, we're going to create a new table of time. We're going to create that, and now we're going to think about what is the fundamental basic things that we absolutely need. Now I'm going to steal from the other database, and I'll show you what the settings are, but they are the defaults that I put into every table, no ifs, ands, or buts. I've already talked about the ID field, but what about the other fields? Well, let's go steal those. Over here in this database, they are these right here. All right, now the ID we've already talked about, that is an auto enter. We do not allow modification. I can see that I actually do have the unique turned on. I'll probably turn that off because of the performance hit that FileMaker, when you do an import, FileMaker has to check if that unique is turned on. And since as a rule, I never expose my primary key values, I'm really not too worried about that uniqueness. I trust that FileMaker's UUID will always be unique. But here are the things that you can add, that I add to most every database. Now, there's one thing I don't, there we go. I forgot this one right here. There we go. I was looking at that and I was saying creation host timestamp and timestamp. I can talk about these, but these are the core actually. A creation timestamp, FileMaker creates that one for you. A modification timestamp, and a creation account name and a modification account name. Notice again that according to what I've talked about in previous videos, that my naming convention, if this was sorted by name, it is currently sorted by type. All of these would group together. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's switch over here to field name, which is what I want to have as a setting, primarily because it allows me to keep all of my items grouped together and also allows me to keep my relationship graph nice and tidy. But we can see everything gets grouped together. So those three, and the ID, all of my core fields. All right, so let's talk about, because these are really easy. Creation timestamp, super simple when we look at the settings on that. FileMaker, we just basically check this box and we say it's a timestamp. Now, why a timestamp over a date or a time? Well, a date and a time forces you to keep them separate, and that you would use when you know that the time upon which a record is created and the date, you want to use those. You're going to use them if the database is going to need to extract data out, such as show it in portals or do finds based on those individual pieces of data. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. There's nothing that prevents you from searching a timestamp for just a specific date and allowing that date to include all 24 hours of a given time range. So you can use a timestamp. It's more concise, but you have to think about the data that you're planning for. If you're going to want to have them be separate, if you're doing like really finite calculations on times of things, then maybe you want to have two separate fields instead of just the one of the timestamp. And that just again comes down to the database that you're developing. For, I don't know, it's just a random percentage out of my head. For 90% of the time, just a regular timestamp is going to work because it gives you both pieces combined into one. But just recognize that there will be times that you want to do that, because I have had databases where I use a timestamp and then I need to leverage the creation timestamp and I end up creating an extra date field which does an auto enter on the timestamp just in order to get one piece of the date. Think about database systems where you want to be able to see things of financial transactions that have all happened within a given month, or everything that's happened within a given year. You're going to have to break and parse this date down based on how you want to extract your data out. So think about that at the outset, know whether or not that's going to be the case. All right, so those are easy, and that was just a little bit of a tip on there. Here is one that you may not anticipate as a new FileMaker learner: creation host timestamp. Now, obviously, we work in a very diverse world in our globally connected world that we have. And so not everything is specific to you, including time. So I work with a couple of companies, and we have people all across the United States, and they're all in different time zones. I also work on database systems where we have people in completely different countries, which obviously have different time zones. As a new FileMaker learner, I can implore you, or I do, that you actually learn about the time zone shifting nature of working with other people in different time zones. Everything is based off of what they call GMT, or Greenwich Mean Time, or it's also called UTC, or Universal, I don't know what UTC, look it up on Wikipedia. I don't know if it's Universal Time Code or whatever. I believe those are synonymous, both the same thing, unless there's some slight difference. But basically, GMT or UTC is the 0 point, and then from that point going out in both directions, you have plus and minus of the amount of time difference there is between time zones. Well, if you always rely only on your timestamp is being captured based on the local time zone of the client. There's nothing that's common between two different copies of FileMaker when it comes to time. So that's where we often add in this creation host timestamp, because FileMaker, wherever it's served from, if your server is in Texas, but you have people in California and you have people in New York, which are obviously in different time zones, you want to know what is the time. You don't want to have to do the math by looking at just the creation timestamp. When is this record actually created relative to all other records that were created? So FileMaker does not give you this actual option of a creation host timestamp. So let's take a look at it. and what it actually is. Notice that we have the creation and it only has timestamp, and the modification only has timestamp. Those, again, are local times only to your client when the record is created. So we have to create an auto-enter calculated value if we want to get the host timestamp of FileMaker server. Notice that we have a do not replace existing checked on because we never want it to be replaced after the first time that it's actually created, and we absolutely do not allow modification. So even if we're going to expose this field and make it searchable, which many times you do, we want to check that box for sure. What does it look like? Well, here again is our friend, the let function. So go reference the let video that I did earlier on where we talked about calculations and fields in the previous series. Let allows us to take advantage of triggering a calculation. When do we want to trigger that calculation? You can see right here I've set a variable called trigger, and that variable basically says I want you to trigger when you use FileMaker's get field function. Now in this database, I am using a custom function. What is the custom function? It is null, what you see on screen there. What is the null custom function? It is simply that. Just a set of double quotes. Now this is purely a thing that I do for convenience. Some developers complain about this because it creates what's known as a dependency. In other words, this calculation is dependent upon the existence of this particular custom function, when I could have very easily just put in the double quotes. So if you like the double quotes and you don't want to have the dependency, then put in the double quotes. What does the dependency mean? Well, it simply means that if I was to copy this particular calculation and take it over into my other database, it will not actually paste successfully because I have not met the dependency of taking the null custom function first unless I knew that I needed to do that. So again, that's up to you whether or not you want to have that. But we can see what is happening within the custom function. Let is saying, here is my variable. I want you to just get a field. What field? No field. It doesn't matter. By the mere fact that you're trying to get a field, that causes this calculation to actually evaluate. What does it evaluate? Get current host timestamp. So this is how you can actually cause FileMaker to evaluate. It's a trick. You're basically saying get something. What? Oh, get nothing. Okay, well, I got something. Well, because I tried to get something, I evaluated the whole calculation. Therefore, I'll just get the current host timestamp and put that into this field. And that happens on record creation. So what's really nice about that is having both of those now, I know that no matter what, my database is going to have the time that it was created based on the server time, which I can calculate the difference between it and UTC if I wanted to, but more importantly, I can calculate the difference between the client and the host timestamp, and it just makes things a lot easier. So as a FileMaker learner, this is one of those things that you sort of just stumble upon later on as you're developing, and it dawns on you, wait, all these records, the times are off in terms of their creation, what's going on? So again, it's good that I looked at that because I need to fulfill the dependency. Let's go look at the custom function that I have in this database. We'll go to Manage, Custom Functions, and just to prove to you that it was what I said it was, we'll go look at null. Notice that null has no parameters. Again, if you're a new FileMaker learner, please do not be afraid of going into FileMaker's custom functions. They are a central place where you can keep code that is common to the whole file. And look at this, null actually doesn't even have anything in it. It simply has a comment in it. I don't even have a blank set of quotes, which is not absolutely required. So why do I use this function? Because it just makes my code easier to read. So with the null function, which I'm going to copy right now with Command C and say OK, going to go over to my time track database, zoom in and open up my custom functions, and I'm going to paste that in. All right, so I've met the dependency. I've got my null custom function. You can create the null custom function in your copy of FileMaker unless you're not using a copy of FileMaker Advanced. If you're watching this video and you do not have FileMaker Advanced, you will not have this tools window. You will not have script debugger and data viewer. I highly, highly, highly suggest if you're going to develop anything significantly powerful in FileMaker, get a copy of FileMaker with the developer tools, that is FileMaker Advanced. Otherwise, I am just going to have to give you the starter file, which I'll put and link on to YouTube. All right, so let's go copy those fields. You can create them for yourself. We've already taken a look at them. Creating the account name, it's really easy. Check this and do this. Prohibit the modification. Do the timestamp, creation, timestamp, create a modification and timestamp. UUID, you know how to do that. Again, I mentioned on the UUID, I will probably take off the validation of unique because I trust it. And it comes with that little bit of a penalty that it has to check against that record against all other records when I import. So with those, I should be able to just select all of them and I can copy. You're going to have to create them. Once you create them, you're going to be able to copy them from that table to all other tables. There is no reason once you make these fields to ever have to make them again. Use FileMaker's copy and paste. All right. And we'll go to my time table. Startup does not need anything currently. There are times where I will add them in. Let's see, did I actually not get those copied? I don't know that I copied them successfully. I'll click the copy button just in case. And I'll click switch to my time, switch to the right table, and I'll paste those in. All right. Now, one thing that I do actually do is I will put these sometimes in a very large, complex database. When I start to create many more defaults for my file, I will actually create a dedicated table called template. And it gets hooked up to nothing. It's just there. Again, having an extra table is there's no cost almost to having that table and having the fields in that particular table. It's just a way for you to store things in the file if you want to have a separate database or a separate table. Otherwise, know that you can pick from any table where it has your defaults and you can select all of those and then just paste them. The reason that I use a template table is it's a little bit easier to come into just that template table and do a Command A or a Control A and just select everything at one time. Command C, Control C, and then go paste it. I don't have to individually select them. But if you do want to individually select them, it's simply a matter of holding down the Command key. Select one, and then you can arbitrarily select any other number of items that you want, copy them, and go paste them into the table. But that template table is really helpful. So that is going to probably bring us to a wrap here on our 30 minutes for putting all the things that I put in place for startup. At this stage, I am ready to now basically replicate this into all the rest of my tables. Now, at this stage, it's really pretty easy for me to, instead of necessarily copying all of these, creating the table, and then pasting into a new table, I know that I'm going to have a table called projects. So because this table currently only has my defaults, what's the easiest thing to do? To basically just duplicate it. And there is no duplicate button, you notice here, but there is a copy and paste. So if I just click copy and paste, I get right over here just a second table, and I'll just rename it to projects. And click change, and there we go. We've got the core setup of what I need as the whole startup process when I start my file. The file options are set. I've got a startup script. I've got a shutdown script. I've taken care of at least fundamental security, turned it off so that it's going to give me a prompt. I happen to leave on a blank password. That's okay as we go through this. I've got my 2 core tables that I want to start with, and those core tables have my base template fields. So if you have any questions, this is a good time to come up with those. One of the things I also do is all initial table occurrences as I go into the relationship graph. I collapse those down and I start to create my developer tables. That is also part of my startup process. And I'll refer you to the previous video that I shot about developer tables. You can search for that on YouTube here, or look within, it may have been the previous series, or it may be within this series, the data structure and schema. All right, so let's see if we've got any questions for today with regards to what we've covered here. We'll switch over here and bring up the questions. All right. Hello, everybody. Hey, Lee, HBH Group, all of my regulars that are joining me live with this series, and Thenos from Greece. All right. So here's our first question for today. We've got, does the number of custom calculations influence performance? I imported 1,420 of them into a solution. Custom functions do not make any type of performance impact. They only add, just a few bytes to a file. They only make a performance impact when you start to put them into use. When you put them into use, and depending on what the custom function actually does, for example, FileMaker has the ability, custom functions are the only place where FileMaker can actually do recursion. This is completely advanced topic, but they've got two different types of recursion. We've got standard recursion, which is basically working off of a stack, and we'll have to shoot a video talking about the stack, but they also have tail recursion, which is a second type of recursion in terms of being able to iterate. Now, FileMaker is limited in terms of the number of iterations it can have within its recursion. A normal recursion, I believe, is 10,000, and then tail recursion maybe 50,000. But again, the performance hit only comes into play when those are actually used. The biggest penalty that you pay with, I'd say, that many custom functions is naming them and managing them. If you have a bunch of different standards and you've pulled custom functions from different places, then if you don't have some type of consistency, whereas over on FileMaker standards, for example, one of the things that we always try to do is have a consistent prefix. So out of all of the custom functions that deal with multiple values, all of those will be prefixed with the word values. So it would be like values extract, or values unique, or values sort, or values combine. You will group those using your prefix, because FileMaker really, the way that it presents everything are just in these dialog boxes with lots of things sorted in alpha order. So using a prefix is really the only way that you can group things together within FileMaker. All right, so our next question was, if I duplicate a record, the UUID doesn't create a new one, but also a duplicate field. Excellent question, Eric. Let's switch over really quickly and answer that one so that we know what's going on, because this is a very key issue with regards to how you want to use FileMaker, how you want to treat FileMaker. So we're going to go into our defined database, look at our tables, and go to our time table, and we're going to look at our ID field. When we double click this for our options, what Eric is probably talking about on our auto enter tab is this option right here. Do not replace existing value, if any. This is the one option that sort of controls whether or not you're going to be able to use FileMaker's duplicate or enforce that you have to use or create your own duplication process. Now, this is a matter of preference. FileMaker provides us with a duplicate option for records, and we can see what happens if we have this checked. Now, currently, there's a dependency right there that I broke in mine. I was actually using a custom function called unique ID, which basically just makes a call to get UUID. So I'm glad I found that. So we can take a look at our example here and put that one field onto this layout, and we can see what Eric is talking about here. Let's grab the field and startup table. That's why. Do I have a time table? There we go. Don't save. And there's all of my fields right there. And we really only want to look at this ID field so we can look at what I'm talking about duplicates. All right, we'll create a new record and our ID will be created. So we've got our ID. I am now going to use FileMaker's duplicate option, or the ability to duplicate a record. When I duplicate the record, you'll notice that right now I am getting a new UUID. So on record number 1, my record was 10D5. On record number 2, it's 7D26. Now that happened because of that option on the field of the do not replacing. Now, if this is checked right here, which we'll check, and we'll get out of our dialog here, and we will now duplicate this record. We'll go up to our records and let's choose duplicate. We now have 3 records. but notice that the key has been duplicated. If I click out of this, I now have a problem. So this is definitely something that you absolutely want to be aware of. I now have two records, record number 3, and as I use the arrow keys to go up, record number 2, we can see that I switched right here from record number 1 to record number 3. I'm switching between them. Look at that. It is duplicate IDs. Ugh. This is terrible. This is absolutely bad. This is exactly what you don't want. So if you're going to use FileMaker's duplicate, you are going to uncheck this box. If you are very paranoid about having duplicate IDs, then you are going to leave this checked. You are going to turn on prohibit modification, and you are going to, within validation, for sure, set on unique value, because you never, ever, ever want to have a duplicate primary key. That is absolutely cardinal rule number 1, don't break it. But this doesn't mean that you can't duplicate records. What it means now is that you have to take responsibility for duplicating records. You can't just use FileMaker's easy Command or Control D to duplicate the record. You have to add a duplicate button. Now, I happen to like that method. I like to know that there is absolutely no possible way that this particular key could become duplicated, because FileMaker won't allow it because of the validation. So let's get rid of that. Oh, I just duplicated again. Let's actually get rid of that. You can see that FileMaker is going to say, I cannot have this possibility of a duplicate ID. I'm going to revert it. That's actually going to take my record away, and now I'm going to delete this one, which is my duplicate. And so if I try to use FileMaker's duplicate command, it will duplicate the ID, but I have to take over with a script, and I would have to change this ID value, which is possible to do with a script. So I would typically create a duplicate button, and I take control over the duplication. I duplicate the record. I know that the key is going to be duplicated, and I intentionally set a new key into that primary key field because I feel like I've taken control over the duplicate. If you're more relaxed about things, then go ahead and just use FileMaker's ability to duplicate a record. You're just going to have that box unchecked on the field options. So we'll revert, and hopefully that gives us a good example of what that is. All right, so I've got time for one more question, and we'll switch over to Chrome here. All right. The ID field you had set to replace existing, surely that would not be able to change if a value exists. You never know sometimes when you code things, or if you code things with other people, if a field, remember, scripts take total precedence. A script can change any field when that script is run with full access as a developer. And we learned earlier that we can set any script to run as if it was a developer and actually just change a field. So it is possible to change an ID. And sometimes when you're writing a complex routine, sometimes you may be getting an ID and going over and creating another ID. And if you accidentally have a duplicate ID, the only way that you can 100% be guaranteed that you know that it's not going to be duplicated is with FileMaker's own internal options of a unique value, using FileMaker's validation and saying this particular field cannot, no matter what, have any duplicates. Otherwise, if you do take off the unique and allow for duplicates, because you want to allow duplicating records with FileMaker's native menus, then you take responsibility that it is, in even the remote possibility, able to create a duplicate key. And so that just comes with time. You can be confident and use that feature. It's just a matter of your comfort level. All right. Only prevent modification, exactly. And we got an answer to that. Cool. Do I have the time for one more? Can we add any specific serial number along with UID to recognize you definitely can, Rana. You can, in fact, I suggest it. Have a human readable exposed key, which isn't, don't think of it as a key, just think of it as your serial number for doing finds and things like that. But then your UUID, you are going to typically never show, always hide, and that's what you're going to wire up and use relationships for. But of course, you can show and use as many other identifying key values that you want for users to be able to look for things. Customer numbers can be a serialized number. Invoice numbers can be serialized. Beyond your primary key, and the only reason we use UUIDs is because it allows for disconnected ability for databases to go out, collect data, and the biggest thing is synchronization. Using UUIDs, you can do synchronization. Using serial numbers, it's a lot more difficult. And we also know that FileMaker using a number-based UUID is actually faster in terms of performance than this alpha-based UUID. But of course, most FileMaker databases, they're really not so complex that you're going to notice those performance hits until you get to that point, and you can always change to number-based keys. It's a little bit of a hassle, but I just did a video about it over on the magazine website. All right. So I think that's going to give us a wrap for today's video. Thank you very much. Let's see. We had one more question that came in right there. With the housekeeping fields, if I add a Z to the start of the field and force it to the bottom, would that just be a personal preference? Exactly. It is very much a personal preference. I don't personally like it, but some people with regards to sorting will use characters in order to force those to the bottom. Personally, I like to force things up at the top that are no-nonsense characters, and that's just simply preceding fields with the underscore. The underscore is not a valid math operator, and so it won't conflict with any of your field naming, and you can use that to get fields to sort to the top. Using the Z, I've always been looking for something other than, I don't know why, I just don't like to see the letters themselves. David, would you suggest to use a serial number within a table or use a function with get inth records? Don't know what that might actually be applying to, but I definitely use serial numbers. Get inth records? Oh, I see what you're saying. That's usually a question that is a human-specific thing that we sort of get annoyed by, which is having inconsistencies and gaps. If I'm to read this correctly, because I went through this phase where I wanted to have everything's be in sequence too, where you would have records 1 through 10 in your database, but your next serial number is, say, 15, because those records in between 10 and 15, 11, 12, 13, 14 have been deleted, but you want to have the next sequence of a number be 11 because it comes after 10 instead of 15. Because if you use FileMaker, its auto-enter, then you're going to get 15. You sort of just have to be okay with gaps. Using the maximum number of records to find out what the very next serial number might be actually requires a little more effort than it's worth than to just use the automatic serial numbers and just deal with the gaps. And I became okay with the gaps. So hopefully that's the answer to that question. All right, so that's going to give us a wrap for today's video. As always, you can subscribe here on YouTube. That's going to come up right there, and the next video in this series will come up right there. You can always check out more content over at FileMakerMagazine.com. And until the next video, much luck and happy file making. I'll see you later.